Good morning, everyone. We'll just give people 1 minute to get in here and join us this morning. Good morning. My name is Hlynur Guðjónsson. I'm the Icelandic ambassador to Canada. I welcome you to this webinar where we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of Icelandic immigration to Canada. We have a great lineup. With us this morning, Dr. Ólöf Garðarsdóttir from the University of Iceland, and she will be giving us an introduction to the Icelandic immigration to the Americas, 1850 to 1914, followed by Ryan Eyfjord, Associate Professor at the University of Winnipeg, and Ryan will talk about what the Icelanders were meeting when they were coming to Canada in those first years, the situation here within government, etc. We have also with us David Johnson from the Icelandic Emigration Center at Hofsós. And David will, when we go into the Q&A part of the webinar, he will give us a short insight into what Hofsós is, and then moderate the panel and take questions from the audience. The questions will be, if you have questions, put them in the chat while you're listening to Ryan and Dr. Ryan and Dr. Ólöf, and then David will view that and pick up some of those questions and put them before the panel. But without further ado, Ólöf, welcome to the discussion, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you. As you already told us, I will talk about the Icelandic immigration to Americas. The Icelandic immigration didn't actually start until around 1870, but I will talk a little bit about the international context. So I think sort of the period from 1850 until the First World War is kind of the period that I will be dealing with or touch upon. First, about sort of the onset of migration or emigration to the Americas from Europe. From the 1820s until the beginning of the First World War, millions of Europeans emigrated to the Americas. This growing emigration was closely related to rapid population increase in Europe after 1750. Population pressure, political unrest, and increased proletarization were important drivers behind the emigration from Europe to the Americas, mainly to North America. Increased demand for labor in the Americas occurred at the same time as there was lack of land in Europe, and authorities in the Americas often supported emigration by paying part of the fare or offering the new settlers land for cultivation. I presume that Ryan will talk a little bit more about that in his presentation. But these factors, in combination with technological advances in seafaring and in railways, as well as liberal migration policies, facilitated the mass emigration from Europe. And we don't know, of course, exactly how many people emigrated to the US and Canada, but probably there were more than 30 millions from this period, 1850 to 1914. If we look kind of at the nations or the countries from which the most immigrants came, England, Scotland, Ireland, and Germany are often mentioned as sort of on the top of the immigrants. But when you look at sort of immigration rates, the Nordic countries, they were quite a high immigration rate from all of the Nordic countries. We know also when we look at the immigration from the Nordic countries that the sex ratio among immigrants was more even than from most other European countries. So men were often much more numerous than women coming from other countries. And like from many other countries, family migration was most common, especially in the initial stages of the migration. Solitary migration more common towards the end of the 19th century. This picture is taken from a book by Norman and Runblom called Transatlantic Connections, and it shows actually the percentage of men leaving for USA and Canada by country. Those are all the Nordic countries. And you can see that in Iceland, the share of women was notably higher than from the other countries. Probably Sweden comes next to Iceland in that respect. If we look at Iceland from a Nordic perspective, mass immigration from Iceland started later than from the other Nordic countries. Not until the 1870s, there was you can talk about a mass immigration from Iceland. There were, of course, a few emigrants that went to Utah in the 1850s and converted to the Mormon faith. And in 1863, 5 Icelanders emigrated to Brazil, and consequently in 1873, a few more the family and social networks moved to Brazil as well. But for many emigrants or those who had listed up for going to Brazil, Canada became an alternative for those people in 1873. So that was actually the start of the mass immigration from Iceland to Canada. Can be seen as 1873 or 1874. There were considerable regional differences in the immigration rates from Iceland. Most immigrants came from the east and the northeast, especially in the beginning, but even later on, those were the most immigrants actually came from those regions. And what is also interesting is that Canada became the main destination of Icelanders. And here you can see a table that shows the percentage of immigrants from the Nordic countries by destination. So you can actually see that, yeah, almost or more than 90% of all immigrants or overseas immigrants from other Nordic countries than Iceland actually went for the US. But in the case of Iceland, 85% actually went to Canada, 15% to the US. But of course, we know that people often moved between those countries when they had already arrived in North America. So we don't know exactly where people ended up. Next slide. Why did the Icelanders move to Canada and not to the US like the immigrants from the other Nordic country? It's probably the question of the timing. And like Ryan Ayford has already pointed out in his book, mass immigration coincided, or mass immigration from Iceland coincided with Canada's immigrant recruitment campaign focused on Northern Europe. And he actually probably will talk about it later. The 1872 Dominion Lands Act established rules for homestead lands. And that probably explains why Icelanders were more likely than the other Nordics to move to Canada rather than to the US. But there is a clear shift also from the US to Canada around 1870. So Canada becomes a more popular destination also for the other Nordics around or after the 1870s. We often talk about push and pull factors when we look at migration internationally. Was the migration from Iceland to Canada and the US a question of push or pull factor? We know that there were unfavorable climate conditions in Iceland in the 1860s and the early 1870s. We had a sheep disease, deteriorating fishing catches in Iceland at the time. And then we also had a volcanic outbreak in Askja in eastern Iceland in 1875. But there were also pull factors. Agents were placed in Iceland in the 1870s, and they recruited people to move to the Americas. Also, as the emigration proceeded, it was a question of social and kin networks. We have lots of letters from friends and family overseas who describe the situation in Canada and the US as much more favorable than in Iceland. And we must bear in mind that the areas where most of the immigrants came from Iceland, the population was very small there, and there's a high share of the population knew people that already had emigrated. So it was kind of more easy to take this step when you had close relatives or friends that already had settled in either the US or the Canada. We also know that the internal migration, that is migration within Iceland, preceded international migration, and people sort of tended to move in order to improve their situation. And for some people, sort of having met with people who had already emigrated, this was kind of a way to improve your situation, moving or taking the step to move from Iceland to either the US or Canada. Here we see a map of Iceland. I will, in sort of the remaining slides that I will show you, I will talk a little bit about sort of two places in Iceland. Seyðisfjörður, it's a village here that grew very rapidly in the end of the 19th century, but then the population stagnated in the beginning of the 20th century. We have here the mountain of Askja, and I will be looking at sort of the emigrants from the rural area east of Askja and to the immigrants coming from Seyðisfjörður and comparing to those two people. So it's kind of a comparison of rural and urban emigration, or between people coming from rural area and urban area or town, the town of Seyðisfjörður. This figure shows you sort of on the left axis, you have the number of people emigrating either from Seyðisfjörður, this town, or from the rural area of Jökuldals and Hlíðarhreppur. And sort of the dotted line and the axis on your right shows sort of the number of emigrants from Iceland as a whole. Here you see sort of how the emigration from Jökuldals and Hlíðarhreppur increases in 1876, the year after the outbreak of Askja. And you must bear in mind that less than 500 people lived in this area. So it's kind of a 10% of the population who leaves for Canada in this year, or the US. Slightly less people from Seyðisfjörður, but you can see that especially in the 80s and then in the early 1900s, you see numerous people from Seyðisfjörður leaving for the Americas. Okay. Here I sort of compare the type of migration, or the migrants, on the one hand from Jökuldals and Hlíðarhreppur, that is the rural areas close to the mountain of Askja, and from Seyðisfjörður. And first I look at sort of the percentage of people traveling on their own, that is people traveling not in family or with kin. So in the Jökuldals and Hlíðarhreppur, between 22 and 25% of the people traveled on their own, as compared to a higher level when you look at the town of Seyðisfjörður. And especially in 1890 to 1999, more than 40% of the emigrants that had previously lived in Seyðisfjörður traveled on their own, had no family with them. And what is also interesting when looking at the sex ratio in those two places, it was much more common that men emigrated from the rural area as compared to the town. And here I'm just looking at sort of those people who went on their own. That is not the family migration. And I look here at the share of women. And when you look at the rural area, in the beginning, only 20% of the people that traveled on their own were women, compared to 32% in 1890 to 1909. And when you look at Seyðisfjörður, the share of women is much higher. So almost half of the people that traveled on their own were women, and in the later period, more than 60%. So it was actually much more common for women to travel on their own than was the case with men. I think I've already almost used my 15 minutes. Some concluding remarks. It is important to note that, contrary to the other Nordic countries, Canada was the most important destination for Icelanders. Most immigrants from Iceland came from the east and the northeastern part of Iceland. Most of them from rural areas, but there were quite a lot of people who also came from urban areas. The sex ratio of Icelandic immigrants was even, but there were differences between urban and rural areas. And the family migration was predominant in the beginning, but people living in urban areas were more likely to migrate on their own. So you could say that many immigrants had migrated several times within Iceland, or for many of them, emigration offered an alternative to improve their social and economic conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Olaf, and over to you, Ryan.
Stop sharing now.
All right, just thank you, Olaf. Thank you, Helena, for hosting, and to Jenny as well. Thanks, everybody, for being with us this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where you are. And where did my slides go? Let me try that again. Can everybody see that? Is that working? Okay, excellent. Well, here we have a map from 1875, printed by the Canadian government to promote Icelandic immigration to Canada. So I think my talk will fit in very nicely with Olaf's. I'm going to explain the reasons why Icelanders ended up in such disproportionate numbers in Canada. But before we get to the 1870s, we're going to start a little bit closer to the present. In 2021, Canada conducts a national census of the population every 5 years. And the last census was in May 2021, and we're due for another one next year. 75% of Canadian households received the short form questionnaire, but 25%, including my household, received the long form questionnaire, which asked people about their ethnic or cultural origins. So this was the question on the census in 2021. What were the ethnic or cultural origins of this person's ancestors? And the respondents were not restricted to one origin. The instructions said, list as many origins as are applicable. So I dutifully filled out my census form, and I listed Scottish, English, Icelandic, and French as my ethnic origins to accurately indicate the places my recent ancestors came from. So Statistics Canada then, said they counted me in each of those categories. It counted me as being Scottish, as being Icelandic, as being English, and as being French. So in their summaries. Stats Canada used that data, the 25% sample, to create an overall estimate of the numbers of Canadians who identified as being of a particular ethnic or cultural origin. And the estimate for Canadians of Icelandic origin was 101,990 persons. They were spread across the country, but 97% of them were in the 5 provinces that are shaded here: Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC. The highest number in Manitoba, my home province, were 31,000, and then 25,000 in British Columbia as well. So there's a lot of people of Icelandic descent in Canada. If you come with me on a bit of a crazy journey for a second, and imagine that we took these people of Nordic origin in the Canadian census, the people who said their ancestors came from Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway and Iceland, and imagine them as a proportion of the populations of those countries. So with the other Nordic countries, the proportion of the population is relatively small. The small 2.5% in the case of Finland, up to 8.3% in the case of Norway, and Sweden and Denmark are kind of in the middle, 3% approximately. But then you get Iceland, where if we took the Canadians of Icelandic origin and looked at them as a proportion of the Icelandic population, they would be 25% of the Icelandic population today. So this is an interesting thing. And why is this? Why did this happen? Why are there so many Canadians of Icelandic origin, especially when compared to the relatively small population of Iceland itself? Part of the answer is in Olaf's slide in her presentation, where she shows the disproportionate migration to the United States from the other Nordics versus Iceland, where it was disproportionately to Canada. So we have to go back and look at the 1870s when the pattern of Icelandic migration to Canada was established. This pattern continued throughout the period of mass immigration from Iceland, which saw upwards of 20,000 people leave the island before 1914. And using the Canadian data, the Canadian immigration data, they recorded in that period 13,958 people, Icelanders coming to Canada in that period. And you can see on this chart, you've got emigration from Iceland and Icelandic immigration to Canada. In some years, they're completely overlapping, like in the mid 1870s, where everybody who's leaving Iceland is coming to Canada. Particularly in 1876, is that one big spike in the first part, and you still see like most are going to Canada around through most of the period. You'll see some odd instances where the number of people coming to Canada is greater than the number of people leaving Iceland. And what that reflects is people moving from the United States into the Canadian prairie provinces. There was a general pattern of migration from the US Midwest to the Canadian prairies around the turn of the last century. If you think about a very famous person like Stefan G. Stephenson, started in Wisconsin, moved to North Dakota, and then later moved to Alberta and settled near Markerville and became known as the poet of the Rocky Mountains. So there was a lot of that going on, and that's part of what's reflected in this chart. So how did this pattern get established? The first thing to say, I guess, is that Canada in the early 1870s was very keen to attract immigrants. They were looking to compete effectively with the United States and were prepared to offer various incentives to get immigrants to come to Canada. But some of this is really idiosyncratic and weird. And here is one of the weird instances. This is John Lowe, who was the senior civil servant responsible for immigration. And this letter on the right is, he wrote this to the Secretary of the Governor General, Lord Dufferin, discreetly asking Dufferin if he thought that Canada should recruit Icelanders as immigrants. This is a case where it's really important to look at the original document, because when I went to look at this letter in Ottawa, I flipped over the letter and I found Dufferin's response on the back side of the letter. Some of you will know that Lord Dufferin was considered an expert on Iceland because he had visited it in 1856 on a tour of the northern seas. He wrote about this in his published book, Letters from High Latitudes, which was very well known and as a travel log of Iceland. So Lowe asked Dufferin's opinion, and Dufferin said, he said, I should say the Icelanders would make good immigrants. They very much resemble the Norwegians. They are quite peaceable folk, Lutheran in religion, but not fanatical. And that was it. Then Lowe said, well, Dufferin says yes, so let's mobilize the resources of the Department of Agriculture, which was responsible for immigration, to offer subsidies to Icelanders coming to Canada. And that's sort of the way it went. He wrote to the head agent in London and said, an immigration of Icelanders is very much desired in Canada. So in the 1870s, Canada offered various subsidies to new immigrants. They had something called the passenger warrant system that assisted immigrants by reducing the cost of their passage. So it's like subsidizing their fare essentially to make it more affordable. And the part of this was that they had to agree to come to Canada, though. They couldn't just get that subsidy and then go to the United States. They had to agree to come to Canada. Canada also worked with had a network of emigration agents working to promote Canada's interests in important places like Glasgow and Liverpool. And some of these agents were involved in the recruitment of Icelanders. And also the provinces had their own agents too. In Canada's constitutional arrangement in the British North America Act in 1867, the provinces and the federal government had joint jurisdiction over immigration matters, so that the provinces could go out and recruit people that would meet their particular needs. So you had federal government agents, you had provincial government agents, and then you also had agents of steamship companies like the Allan Line, the Scottish-Canadian steamship company, who were also signing people up to travel to Canada. And Canada gave those steamship company agents a bonus for booking people through to Canada. And at the beginning of the 1870s, there was an agent in Iceland named Guðmundur Lambertsson who was working for the Allan Line, and he was one of the people who helped make that connection between the Allans and then the agents of the Canadian government in the UK. So there's this whole network of agents who are looking to offer subsidies and help to bring Icelanders to Canada. And it's entirely possible that this ship, the SS Parisian of the Allan Line, could have been bringing Icelandic immigrants. This is some photograph sometime between 1881 and 1914. You can see the Citadel of Quebec in the background there. This ships came from mostly from the UK, bringing Icelanders to Canada, and they would be landed at Quebec and then brought inland. So the first reason why this pattern developed is that Canada made a really aggressive move to recruit Icelanders by offering these various subsidies to get them to come to Canada instead of the US. The second factor is that Canada offered free land to intending immigrants. This is something Olaf mentioned as well. The provinces, Nova Scotia and Ontario in particular, also had their own version of free lands for immigrants. And the Markland colony in Nova Scotia, those Icelandic immigrants in the mid-1870s were offered free land. Initially, when Icelanders came to Ontario, they were offered free land in the area that's now Muskoka and Victoria County. But the really big one was in Western Canada, the Dominion Lands Act, and where the land in the entire region was carved up into these townships where individual settlers could homestead land. And this is an example of a Dominion Lands Act standard township survey for the Northwest. I'll show you this map of Manitoba, and you can see it's from 1874, and each of the little squares within this map represents that same division of the landscape into these townships. And an individual settler could claim one of these 160-acre homesteads for an entry fee of $10. And then if they performed certain settlement duties, they would receive the patent to that land, giving them the land in fee simple, that is private ownership of the land. So when John Lowe initially said that that Canada wanted to recruit Icelanders, he also said they will be afforded transportation to the Northwest, and that where they will have the opportunity to claim lands. So they could claim lands as individuals. But this wasn't it. This was, with the Icelanders, there was another special arrangement, which was part of Canada's overall policy for Western colonization. And this is the granting of reserves to particular ethnic groups. In 1875, 150 years ago, the Canadian government established the Icelandic Reserve on the shores of Lake Winnipeg, which the Icelanders called Nýja Ísland, or New Iceland. And this was part of a policy of the government of granting these large blocks of land to ethno-religious communities to encourage them to settle in the Canadian Northwest. The idea was that once that initial community was established, their friends and relatives and neighbors from their home country would follow them, and that there would be a chain migration that would happen that would establish an ongoing pattern of migration to that region. Probably, other than the Icelanders, the most famous example of this is the Mennonites from Russia. And you can see on this map down in the bottom part, close to the US border, the Mennonite West Reserve and the Mennonite East Reserve, which were the same policy of granting these large blocks of land to these ethno-religious groups to come in and claim lands under the overall regulations of the Dominion Lands Act. So what this meant was that within those reserves, only people of those particular ethnocultural groups could claim homesteads within those lands. This policy was based on the practices of the U.S. railroad and land companies. That was the model for this, that it would encourage settlement into these regions. So you had subsidies for migration and transportation. You had the offer of free land. And then the last thing that I'll mention is the activities of Icelandic agents, that is, Icelanders returning to Iceland to recruit emigrants. And here is the first one of these agents, Sigtryggur Jónasson, who also happened to be the first Icelander to settle in Canada. If you look at the census of Canada in 1871, there are 0 Icelanders in Canada, 0. But then in 1872, there's 1, and it's Sigtryggur Jónasson. And he later became an agent and became known as the father of New Iceland. He helped pick the location of the Icelandic Reserve and was an important leader throughout its history. But he wasn't there when they initially settled in 1875. He was back in Iceland organizing the next party of emigrants. And these were some of the people displaced by the volcanic eruption of 1875. When we think about these agents, though, Sigtryggur Jónasson and his cousin and political rival, Baldvin Baldvinsson, who emigrated in 1873, we can't imagine them as just going out and giving lectures and handing out pamphlets. They did that sort of thing, but they were logistical support for the immigrants. And one of the things that they did, which was really important, was that they helped the immigrants sell their livestock in the British market. they arranged for the transportation of livestock to the UK to give the emigrants the capital that they needed to start out in North America. So that was they're logistically organizing these emigrations in collaboration with the Canadian government, tying into all the various subsidies and supports that were available for those people. They did distribute literature, and this here is the first example of this, a pamphlet called Nýja Ísland Canada. Nýja is misspelled here. It was published in Ottawa in 1875, and this was distributed to Icelandic immigrants in the 1870s, explaining what they could find in Canada, what to expect, and that was part of what the one effort that Canada had to encourage people to emigrate. There were later pamphlets, and Canada also subsidized the Icelandic ethnic press, the newspapers, to publish information about Canada to intending immigrants. This is the map, returning to this, that was included within the pamphlet Nýja Ísland Canada. It's not accurate. There's a couple of things here that are a bit off. One is that the Canadian Pacific Railway did not actually exist at this time. So you'll notice it says projected Central Canadian Railway, and you'll see where it was projected to go just west of the Icelandic Reserve, like skirting the west side. That's not ultimately what happened, but this is the way it was presented to intending immigrants. The wheat zone with grains and grasses on here is also very overly optimistic of the region, the agricultural capabilities. Some of this region is not very well suited to farming. But this was presented to show the distances and to present Canada in a favorable light, especially compared to the United States. The journey from New York to Liverpool is shown as being longer, or Liverpool to New York is longer than the journey from Liverpool to Quebec on this, which was part of the promotion, part of the sell job of encouraging people to come to Canada. So finally, just to show you this, come back to Manitoba, and the first census of Manitoba in 1870, there are 0 Icelanders. The population of the province is overwhelmingly Indigenous in origin. In 1881, that's starting to change, and they already represent more than 1% of the population. By 1886, it's jumped to more than 2% of the population, and it goes up to as high as like 2.3% approximately of the population. And by 1916, at the end of the period of mass immigration from Iceland, there are more than 12,000 Icelanders in the province of Manitoba. So that initial effort to try to recruit people by this means of subsidies and land and facilitating immigration through agents, it had the desired effect of attracting people to the unlikely scenario where a whole bunch of Icelanders are now in the middle of the North American continent in the province of Manitoba, and their descendants, including me, remain there to this day. So that's what I have to say. I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you may have. I'll just stop my share and turn things over to David.
Thank you. It's been a great couple of presentations from Olaf and Ryan, and I've got a couple of questions for them, but I really encourage the audience to submit questions through the chat box. And after I've got a few remarks talking about Hofsós, we'll get to those questions. Iceland is really one of the few countries that has a museum that actually talks about this immigration story. I can only think of Ireland and Germany having a similar kind of museum that tries to describe why people left and where they went, what the motivating factors were. Hofsós is a beautiful little town up in Skagafjörður, about 5-hour drive north of Reykjavik, a town of maybe only 180 people living there permanently, yet it's got this museum called the Iceland Immigration Center, or Vesturfararsetrið. I had the privilege of visiting the museum back in 2009 for the first time, and there was a wonderful man there named Nelson Gerard, a genealogist who shared with me some things I didn't know about my family origins in Iceland. And the last 2 summers, I've had the opportunity of kind of walking in his shoes, being the volunteer genealogist there on site. I wish I had some slides that I could show you some pictures around the town and of the museum, but I'm kind of filling in at the last minute for Valgeir Thorvaldsen, who is the creator of the museum. About 30 years ago, this man, at about age 35, was looking at the town of Hofsós as a dilapidated, falling apart town. And as a carpenter, he saw potential in a lot of these old buildings. And he also had a vision of telling the story of why so many people left Iceland. And the town has been renovated. The museum is now housed in 3 different buildings near the harbor of Hofsós. And I just really encourage people, if you're up in North Iceland, to come visit the museum. You can check out the museum's website at www.hofsos.is. And I'll be back there in 2026 for the summer. I've got a couple of questions, and the first one I want to pose to Olaf. You had talked about climate and volcanic activity being a push for people.
Mhm.
You also talked about socioeconomic factors. What were their push factors? What were the things that were ingrained in social society, hierarchy, government that maybe pushed people away as well?
Well, interesting question, yes. Yes, maybe that is something that we have actually, yeah, earlier we also often tried to find sort of explanation of this kind when we discussed emigration from Iceland. I'm not sure that I would agree with those ideas that there was some kind of evil governments or evil Danes who kind of pushed people to emigrate. I think it was more like kind of the situation you were living in, and that there were sort of challenging events in Iceland. We had kind of those economic and social events, especially in the north and the east of the country in the 1860s, sort of deteriorating fishing catches and yeah, climatic conditions, this sheep disease that also affected many of the farmers hard. But I think there are also other factors that I might be talking more about when I sort of meet with my colleagues in Winnipeg next month. I think it's kind of interesting and we have not paid enough attention to sort of the migratory behavior of Icelanders. Icelanders were extremely mobile, even in the 18th and the early 19th century. People tended to move between areas just to sort of to improve their situation and the conditions. And I think that is actually a driving factor as well when you kind of have migrated. For example, many of the people who migrated from Seyðisfjörður had earlier lived in the southwestern part of the country, migrated to the east because there were promises there. You could find better, better living standards there. But then sort of there was a collapse of some of the industries where people were attracted to. And then people tended to think, well, okay, I have already moved once. I moved between Keflavik or Reykjavik to Seyðisfjörður. And I met this woman who actually decided to emigrate to Canada. Why not try to sort of, improve my situation by emigrating? So I think that is a very important factor that we need to look into, because even today Icelanders are very mobile and tend to emigrate to a larger extent than other Nordic people.
Thank you. That's a really great possible new area to kind of explore. One of the reasons we talk about at the Museum for Immigration was that opportunity, lack of opportunity. And there were only so many farms to be farmed. And unless you were like maybe the oldest son of the farmer, you really had not much of a chance to ever own your own farm. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, there were not people who owned many people who owned their farms in Iceland. They were tenant farmers, most of them. So there was always this insecurity, even if you were the oldest son of a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
So that is probably one of the factors that explains why people would move. There was not enough land, or the land was not good enough.
Always very interesting to try to look back in time and make suppositions about what was happening and what was motivating people.
Exactly.
A question for Ryan. You talked about the immigration to central Canada. I'm curious what you can share with us about what pushed people farther west to British Columbia. I'm from Seattle originally, and I know Seattle was seeing its first Icelander there in the early 1880s.
Yeah, exactly.
Why would people be moving on yet again?
Well, that's a great question. And the graph that I showed of people moving to Canada or people moving from the United States to Canada, what it doesn't show is Canadians moving to the U.S., which, this was an important thing as well, and it's not as well studied. You're absolutely right. There was a big movement of people from the prairies to the Pacific coast on both sides of the border, but particularly on the U.S. side in places like Blaine and Point Roberts and Bellingham. And one of the factors that was attracting people to that region is the Pacific Ocean fishery. And oftentimes these were people who were experienced in the fishing industry in Manitoba. They had worked on the lake fishing and on Lake Winnipeg, and so were based, for example, out of Selkirk, and then moved to the west to pursue ocean fishing and establish themselves there. So that's something that really hasn't been studied as well, the internal migration within North America after initial settlement. There is a big movement of Canadians of Icelandic descent, both people born in Canada and people born in Iceland. They live in Canada, and then later on they move to the United States, and their descendants are there to this day. And that's something that hasn't been studied as thoroughly as it could be.
Ryan, there's a question in the queue from someone talking about the interaction between Icelanders and the Native American population, or the Indigenous people. The U.S. has a history of really, fighting with the Indians and lots of killing. How did that interaction occur in Canada?
Yeah, I saw that question from Vico, I think it was here. And so the scope and scale of military violence against Indigenous people in Canada is different than the United States. There is that military conflict, but it's not on the same scale. The most important example in the Canadian context is the events that are called the Northwest Rebellion or the Northwest Resistance in 1885. Was a resistance movement led by Louis Riel and on behalf of the Métis Nation, but also included some First Nations people fighting against Canada and Canadian encroachment into their territory. Icelanders, some Icelanders, people born in Iceland, volunteered to fight for Canada in 1885 and went to Saskatchewan as members of the Northwest Expeditionary Force. There's an article by L.K. Bertram on this subject on Icelanders serving in the 1885 war.
Interesting.
The Icelandic community in Manitoba especially carried on the tradition of two newspapers, the Lögberg and the Heimskringla newspapers. They were written in Icelandic on a weekly basis, I believe, probably all the way up until the 1950s. And then they were combined, and then shortly thereafter they began printing in English because few people continued to speak Icelandic. What are you gleaning from that? And that newspaper still is alive, but maybe perhaps barely alive. How can we keep Icelandic culture alive in the United States and Canada?
Ooh, that's good. Good question, David.
I think that's for you, Ryan, I guess.
Well, I just on the subject of the newspapers, I'll just Caitlin Parsons asked about the subsidies to the publications. I mean, those publications, David, have faced tough times at many times in their history, and they have had support from the Canadian government in various forms over the years. Going back to the early 20th century, it's being used to help promote immigration and being connected to political parties. So political patronage going to those newspapers to help gain support for the Liberal Party in the case of Lögberg, or the Conservative Party in the case of Heimskringla. So there's political patronage, there's immigration promotion. But then later on in the 20th century, you had the development of multiculturalism as a policy of the Canadian government. And so then Canada starts providing subsidies to Lögberg Heimskringla to help support it as partly by having government advertisements promoting multiculturalism or other government programs in the Icelandic language. So there's various phases of this over time, and really in Canada, the support of the state has been essential to the survival of the ethnic press through its over the long period. And I mean, Lögberg Heimskringla has a tremendous record of being a survivor among the many ethnic newspapers of North America, and it still produces a really high quality newspaper today.
Can I step in there, Ryan? Just to act compared to other immigrant groups in Canada, like for example the Norwegians or the Swedes, have they sort of been publishing similar journals for such a long time as the Icelanders did?
Well, that I don't know. I don't know if there is. I think this is a question for Stefan Jónsson if he's in the group here. But
yeah.
I think Lögberg Heimskringla can take the prize for the second longest ethnic newspaper of North America. I think the Swedes in America, in the United States, kind of hold the title, but not by much.
Okay, interesting.
Our time is running out, and there are no other questions, I don't think, in the queue that we've not addressed. Jenny Hill, would you like to add a few closing remarks for our day today?
I will. Thanks so much, David. And hi to those I have not yet had the opportunity to meet. I'm Jenny Hill. I'm Canada's ambassador to Iceland. I just wanted to start by saying a huge thanks to Olaf, to Ryan, and to David for such an interesting discussion, and then also to the participants. This is a great turnout and just shows the level of interest in this really important anniversary between Canada and Iceland, this 150th anniversary of the Great Migration. And this webinar is actually a series of webinars rather co-hosted by the embassies of Iceland and Canada and the Canadian Embassy in Iceland. And we're super pleased to see the level of interest and engagement in the relationship between our two countries. And in that vein, there's actually, I think this group would be very interested to know, we've got, well, actually not organized by us, but organized by the Icelandic National League of North America. There's another webinar that's coming up on October the 1st, and you can see Per's just posted that in the chat there. And this is in honor, or out of recognition, I should say, of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And this should be an extremely interesting conversation. And of course, there were some questions that came up in this webinar about this. You know, obviously, when the Icelanders came to Canada, there were people that were already there, that were already living on that land. And I had the pleasure to travel to Canada this summer with Iceland's president, who attended the Icelandic Festival of Manitoba. And just hearing about the support that the Canada's Indigenous people gave to the Icelanders when they first arrived. And Iceland has some pretty nasty weather, but not quite the same also as arriving into, the western shores of Lake Manitoba in the middle of winter and all that entails. So this conversation between Glenn Sigurdsson, who's Iceland's honorary consul in Vancouver, and Nigan Sinclair, who's an Anishinaabe writer and educator, to talk about that really important relationships that happened at that time, I think would probably be of interest to this group. And then I also wanted to mention the next webinar in the embassies of Iceland and Canada that will be taking place will be around Remembrance Day. So on November the 12th, we'll be co-hosting a webinar on the relationship between Canada and Iceland in World Wars I and II. And we'll have two PhD scholars, Canadian and Icelandic scholars, who will be presenting on that topic. So another facet to the many facets of the Canada-Iceland relationship. So again, a huge thanks to our speakers today, to Olaf, to Ryan, to David for doing a great job moderating, to Hlynur, of course, our ambassador, or Iceland's ambassador at the embassy in Canada. And David, I will all come visit you in Hofsås and come and see the Immigration Center. You did a great job talking about all the great work that you're doing there. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next events. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you.